Today's subject matter is a bit controversial, and I want to approach it free of bias. That being said, I do need to explain that we're going to be focusing on the Arab nations much more than Israel, because if Israel had lost the Six-Day War, well, there wouldn't really be an Israel left. First, some background information. The Six-Day War was a conflict between the nation of Israel on one side and a coalition of Arab powers consisting of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq to a lesser extent. The conflict had its origins rooted in a number of events from the Suez Crisis, which led to a UN occupation of the Egyptian-Israeli border, to the very founding of Israel itself, leading Arab populations within its borders to feel displaced and unwelcomed. The immediate situation which set the gears of war in motion was a series of guerrilla attacks against Israeli citizens by the Palestine Liberation Organization, a group within Israel's borders who recognized the state as illegitimate and an occupation of Palestinian land. The attack in particular had been a landmine which detonated near the Israeli-Jordan border. The King of Jordan and Israeli government had previously been negotiating for long-standing peace and mutual security. After this incident, the King of Jordan had sent his condolences to Israel in a letter, while Israel assured they had no intention of attacking Jordan. Yet despite this, allegations remained abound that Palestinian forces within Jordan were responsible for the attack, leading Israel to cross the border into Jordan and attack the village of Samu, an action which, as far as all parties involved at the time were concerned, had no justification beyond petty revenge. Other sources suggest this was an Israeli test of the Arab Mutual Defense Pact between Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, to see if and how quickly the other two would come to Jordan's aid. None did. The King of Jordan reprimanded Egyptian President Nasser for refusing to stand up for their ally against the attack. Nasser from that point on doubled down on his promise and assured both Jordan and his other Arab allies that this situation would not be repeated. This setup for war would now only need to be triggered, and it would, in early May of 1967. The Soviet Union, who had been sympathetic to the Arab nations and viewed Israel as an American dominion, wished to solidify its grasp upon the Middle East by driving the Israelis out. The details are hazy as to exactly what specifically motivated what came next, but for some reason or another, the Soviets decided to move Arab nations to attack Israel by sending false information of an Israeli mobilization along the Syrian border to Nasser. Determined to demonstrate the strength of the Arab community and fulfill his promise by standing by his allies, Nasser would advance his soldiers onto the Israeli border, expelling UN forces from the region. Israel was unaware of the Soviet memo and thus thought this was an attempt to intimidate them or a preparation for an invasion. So in retaliation, the small nation, whose forces were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, leveled the playing field by launching what it deemed to be a preemptive strike against the air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, assuring its dominance of the skies for the remainder of the war and assuring it a victory against the relatively undisciplined and undertrained Arab armies. This victory allowed Israel to reclaim historic sites from the three Arab nations and ignited a deep patriotism in not only local Israelis, but the Jewish diaspora across the globe, many of whom began campaigning for pro-Israeli policy primarily in the US and USSR. Israel saw a baby boom and went on to become fairly prosperous. However, this war had crippled and humiliated the Arab nations whose hopes of reclaiming the land of Palestine had been dashed. Anti-Jewish sentiment rose in the Middle East and across communist countries as well, especially as their Jewish populations now aligned closer with Israel than with their birth nation or national ideology, leading to a series of Jewish purges and expulsions from both the Arab and communist sphere. But what if things had gone differently? What if Israel lost the Six-Day War? There are two primary means by which this could have been done. The Soviets could have directly intervened early on, drastically tipping the war toward the Arabs. The USSR had certainly considered doing so, but in our timeline didn't, out of fear that it would initiate direct retaliation by the US, who at the time was too preoccupied in Vietnam to support Israel, but might very well drop that if the USSR had become directly involved. The risks of this option are fairly unavoidable, and thus we'll go with the alternative. Israel never launches Operation Focus, which crippled the Arab air bases. In fact, just to be safe, the opposite happens. Nasser launches a preemptive strike on Israel, wiping out their air force and leaving them vulnerable to a three-front land invasion. Israel falls within 3 days, and the land acquisition becomes basis for a more direct pan-Arab movement. Nasser was a believer in what could best be described as Ba'athism, a philosophy which directly translates to Renaissance, specifically Arab Renaissance. Its core components included the establishment of a united Arab state under one-party leadership until a cultural rebirth could be achieved. It promoted Arab nationalism, political secularism, and economic socialism, with the chief drive of leaving the Arab people free from outside influence, especially that of the imperialist West. The ideology, because of continued Arab decline in the Middle East, had never been grossly successful and has fallen to the wayside of more radical ideologies. Prior to the time of the Six-Day War, Egypt and Syria had essentially been united into a single state, the United Arab Republic. It eventually disbanded after disagreements with Nasser led to a Syrian coup. In this timeline, faith in the pan-Arab idea is reignited, and Syria moves to reunite with Egypt under a one-party government with Jordan. creating a political hierarchy reminiscent of the USSR with a president at its head, if not Nasir, then perhaps someone else. The conquered land of Israel would become the province of Palestine and be annexed into the Second Arab Republic. The US, again having its hands tied in the Vietnam War, is unable to directly intervene until it's too late. By 1968, Americans would have become tired of fighting international wars, and the foothold that they held in the Middle East would now be completely gone. At best, we'd see US forces supplying remnant Israeli soldiers and rebel groups with weapons to combat the United Arab Republic, in essence reviving the Lehi terrorist group bent on the recapture of Israel. 1968 would see Iraq fall under Ba'athist rule and unite with the United Arab Republic, nationalizing its petroleum companies to make the UAR a noteworthy petroleum exporter, a status which would only rise with the 1969 coup in Libya led by Muammar Gaddafi, who himself was a longtime admirer of Nasir and an ideological sympathizer who would lay his hand on the Greater Arab Project, contributing propositions for great irrigation projects such as the man-made river he constructed in our timeline, as well as put heavy emphasis on keeping the UAR debt-free to truly remain independent as he had sought to do in Libya in our timeline. This arrangement would initially work to greatly benefit the Soviet Union, as the UAR would refuse to trade its valuable oil with the US for its funding of the Lehi, driving it into a fuel crisis heightened by the fact that the Saudi king was also sympathetic to Nasir and opposed the US's intervention. It's important to mention that the Saudis throughout this period primarily had their own interests in mind, and flipped between supporting the US, USSR, and Nasir based primarily on what was convenient for them, so the situation could quickly change if the UAR-Saudi relations went sour. The USSR would get a leg up in the Cold War, becoming the primary trade partner of the UAR, existing symbiotically with it, providing protection in exchange for discounted oil sales. The Soviets and Arabs would maintain a fairly healthy relationship. However, much like had been seen with China or Yugoslavia, eventually the Soviets would ask something of the UAR which they simply would not want to do, and it'd be at that point that the USSR would realize the UAR was not a cooperative puppet state, and that's when ties would begin to break down. In our timeline, the Soviets attempted to bring Egypt's stray regime closer under their control through what was known as the Corrective Revolution, a supporting of pro-USSR Egyptian politicians who would initiate a purge of Nasirist governing and military leaders, as well as liberals and Islamists who were perceived as threats to the Soviet order. We'd see this same thing happen again in our timeline, but on a much larger scale, something more akin to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, initially funding a domestic underground communist party to lead a coup, only to follow it up with a direct invasion. But this would dramatically backfire for the Soviet Union, for as much as the Arab states had been cooperating with each other up until this point, they don't have a terrific track record of doing so, and almost inevitably the UAR would have disbanded, unless they were given a solidifying cause, a common enemy to unite against. That's precisely what the Soviet Union would have become. After a long-lasting war, the Soviets would be driven out, and the Arab Republic, though battered, would stand more strongly united than ever, one might even say like France and England had following the Great War. It'd be said that the Arab Republic was now a staple of the modern world, being internationally recognized and not perceived as going anywhere anytime soon. The compound of nations that now form the UAR as well as their leadership would go on to shape more specific policy, as Ba'athist ideology alone would not have been sufficient to govern these nations together, something we saw with the splintering of the ideology along Syrian and Iraqi lines. The UAR would maintain a secular governing policy, but acknowledge that Islam was a core tenet of the Arab identity, creating a separation of church and state, but maintaining Islamic doctrine as fundamental to the wants of the people. The society would very likely remain male-dominated and traditional as to avoid the cultural lashback of the Arab Spring which occurred in our timeline in response to liberalization. The socialist economic system would likely take on a far less hardline character, as even in our world Ba'athism strictly drew the line at the abolishment of private property. Most likely only large businesses would be nationalized and their owners compensated for the remainder of their lives by the state, perhaps with increased social status as well. The young and old would be provided for by social services, including retirement plans and education, which was seen in some Ba'athist practicing Arab nations. The UAR would remain grossly non-interventionist and isolationist despite American intervention through the funding of rebel groups. The state would produce a great deal of wealth as an international petroleum dealer and invest every cent into itself. The Pan-Arabian ideology would go on to further emphasize self-dominance alone, at least until cultural rebirth had been achieved. If the Republic had any ambitions of conquering other nations or vastly expanding internationally to dominate other countries, it would need to be held off until local stability could be gained. It would also likely remain non-nuclear, as a number of these Arab leaders believed nuclear power would paint a large target on their backs. Though, knowing what went down in our timeline, that might not stop a big target from being painted on their backs. Ultimately, this nation continues to better itself and remain closed off from the rest of the world unless trouble comes knocking at its door. Being in as turbulent a location as it is, that might mean a few skirmishes here and there, and perhaps even some minor international upheaval, but if it can keep itself together, it might be able to one day take its place as one of the world's great powers. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z, thanks for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z.